On July 14, 1941, the German army seemed unstoppable, advancing relentlessly towards Moscow just 3 weeks into their invasion of the Soviet Union. But in the small city of Rudnya near Smolensk, the Germans encountered a formidable and previously undisclosed secret weapon wielded by the Soviets. The convoy of German tanks, armored vehicles, and trucks was suddenly bombarded by a relentless barrage of rockets. Vehicles exploded and soldiers fell, caught in the devastating attack. The rockets produced an eerie, never-heard-before howling sound that sent shivers down the spines of the German troops. Overwhelmed with fear, the Germans panicked and fled from the city in disarray. Soon, the Germans discovered the name of this terrifying new weapon, the Katyusha multiple rocket launcher. At the same time, Germany had an equally terrifying weapon in their arsenal, the Nebelwerfer rocket artillery. These rocket launchers were used extensively throughout the war, renowned for their devastating power and the sheer destruction they could unleash. Technically designated as multiple launch rocket systems, both the Katyusha and the Nebelwerfer weapons were available at a fraction of the cost of an artillery gun and could unleash devastating barrages in a matter of seconds, raining hell down on the enemy. These devastating weapons could turn the tide of battle in an instant, raining destruction upon their enemies and leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. But the big question remains, which was more destructive rocket artillery in World War II? Join us as we explore their firepower, impact, and legacy in this epic comparison of Nebelwerfer versus Katyusha. Of all the wonder weapons Hitler sought, the Nebelwerfer came closest to being the most effective, especially considering its cost. Nebelwerfer is German for smoke projector. This rocket artillery was fired electrically by remote control, capable of launching 6 rounds every 90 seconds. It was one of the most effective and sophisticated pieces of rocket artillery used during the war. The launchers were named Nebelwerfer as a deliberate act of disinformation to deceive members of the League of Nations. The literal translation, meaning smoke projector, led observers to believe the weapon system was intended for defensive purposes, creating smoke screens. This misconception allowed the true, devastating capabilities of the Nebelwerfer to remain underestimated until they were deployed in combat. The Nebelwerfer was extremely cheap to build, incredibly reliable, and effective under the most adverse conditions. It required very little training to operate and possessed enormous destructive power. However, it had some drawbacks. Its relatively short range, the visible trails of smoke it left behind, and the expensive, complex ammunition it required. Author and historian James Lucas has pointed out in his research that much of Germany's early success in Operation Barbarossa in 1941 can be attributed to the Nebelwerfer. These rocket launchers instilled fear in many Russian soldiers, contributing significantly to the effectiveness of German operations during that campaign. The Nebelwerfer was light enough to be towed by almost any vehicle and operated using a magneto, eliminating the need for a battery. While the Germans extensively used the Nebelwerfer, the Katyusha rocket system was so secretive that initially, only special NKVD state police personnel and trusted party members were trained and allowed to operate it. However, as the war progressed and the weapon entered mass production, these restrictions were lifted, and the Katyusha became widely available to regular Soviet army troops. The Katyusha rocket launcher was notorious for the loud howling sound it made when fired, with the layout of the rockets on the launcher resembling that of a church organ. This distinctive appearance and sound led German soldiers to nickname it Stalin's organ. The wailing noise of the rockets being launched struck fear into the hearts of those who heard it, earning the Katyusha a fearsome reputation on the battlefield. When fired in salvos of over 100 rockets, Katyushas managed to inflict maximum physical and psychological damage on enemy troops. Similarly, the Nebelwerfer could deliver devastating blows through concentrated barrages. However, both these rocket systems were highly inaccurate and only effective when used in large quantities against widely dispersed targets. Their true power lay in the sheer volume of fire, which could overwhelm and demoralize enemy forces despite their lack of precision. The Katyusha launchers were initially mounted on the Soviet ZIS-5 truck. As the war progressed, they were adapted to a variety of platforms, including rail cars, tank chassis, and boats. Additionally, thousands of trucks received from the U.S. through the Lend-Lease program were converted into carriers for the Katyusha launchers. This versatility allowed the Soviet forces to deploy these rocket launchers across different terrains and combat scenarios, significantly enhancing their operational flexibility and impact. A salvo of M13 rockets fired by a battery of 4 BM13 launchers in 7 to 10 seconds delivered 4.35 tons of high explosives over a 400 square kilometers impact zone. This immense destructive power was roughly equivalent to that of 72 gun batteries, demonstrating the Katyusha's ability to inflict significant damage and disrupt enemy formations with unparalleled efficiency. The favorable performance of the first BM13 battery led to mass production, and by 1942, significant numbers of launchers and their fin-stabilized rockets were available. These rocket launchers were extensively used during the defense of the Soviet Union from the German invasion till the Red Army's march into Berlin. Over 500 batteries of Katyushas saw action on these fronts, operating with great success and contributing significantly to the Soviet war effort. By the end of the war, over 10,000 Katyusha launchers had been produced, along with 12 million rockets. Approximately 200 factories were involved in manufacturing both the launchers and the rockets. One key factor that favored the rapid production of Katyushas was that their launchers and rockets required only light machinery for production. The time and resources needed to produce a single Katyusha launcher were a fraction of those required for a single howitzer, enabling the Soviet Union to quickly and efficiently equip their forces with these devastating weapons. Neither the Nebelwerfer nor the Katyusha were known for their accuracy. They were primarily designed for saturating infantry positions with fire. Neither weapon was originally intended for bunker busting or destroying armored vehicles, although the Germans developed larger variants over time to increase their destructive power. The simplicity of the Nebelwerfer launcher made it difficult to disrupt its manufacturing, prompting Stalin to request Allied airstrikes on chemical and ammunition plants that specialized in Nebelwerfer ammunition. This strategic targeting did temporarily affect deliveries, until the Germans could adjust their production and distribution methods to mitigate the impact of Allied bombing raids. The Russians produced approximately 10,000 Katyusha units during World War II, while the Germans manufactured between 8,500 to 9,000 Nebelwerfer units. In addition to ground-based applications, the Germans also experimented with attaching rockets to aircraft to target bomber formations. However, these efforts were hastily developed and yielded limited results in terms of practical combat effectiveness. The Katyusha had the advantage of being truck-mounted, allowing it to move rapidly away from counter-battery fire. However, it took much longer and was more difficult to reload compared to the ground-mounted Nebelwerfer. A typical Katyusha truck could carry up to 48 rockets, and a battery usually consisted of 4 to 8 trucks. Katyusha would launch 16 rockets, 48 for later models, in 10 seconds, with much less accuracy. But this lack of accuracy turned out to be a benefit. The German soldiers reported the Katyusha rockets to be impossible to escape. The Katyusha rockets had an impressive spread, covering 50 meters along the front and 250 meters deep. They featured an innovative detonation mechanism, with the payload being detonated from both ends of the tube simultaneously. This dual detonation created a much more powerful explosion as the shock waves met in the middle, heating the shrapnel to around 800 degrees Celsius. Additionally, the intense explosion often caused the rocket fuel section to heat up enough to explode on its own, spraying burning fuel and even more white-hot shrapnel over the target area. This combination of factors made the Katyusha a particularly devastating weapon on the battlefield. A large enough salvo of Katyusha rockets created a chaotic mess of shockwaves, hot shrapnel, and burning fuel due to shockwave interference effects. The inherent inaccuracy of the salvo ensured that this area of destruction was sufficiently large, making it nearly impossible for enemy troops to find cover or escape unscathed. The design of the rocket itself, plus the rail launch decision that allowed to make large simultaneous salvos, combined to achieve a devastating effect. This overwhelming and chaotic bombardment further amplified the psychological and physical devastation inflicted by the Katyusha on the battlefield. The Katyusha's impact was amplified by the size of the blast area, the randomness and unpredictability of the hits, the resulting fires, and the sheer power and intensity of the salvo. These factors combined to create a truly terrifying effect on the battlefield. In contrast, the Nebelwerfer, although based on the same principle, did not achieve the same level of psychological impact. It fired 6 rockets with clearly visible smoke trails, hitting a more compact area and having an effect roughly equivalent to artillery shells of the same caliber. To launch a rocket from a rail requires a much more powerful propellant force than from a tube. In a tube launch, the exhaust gases generate pressure that helps push the rocket out of the barrel, in addition to the reactive force of the jet stream. Conversely, when a rocket is launched from an open rail, the propulsion relies solely on the jet stream, as the exhaust gases dissipate into the air and do not create any additional pressure within a barrel. The Soviet Union had been working on developing a new rocket propellant powder since as early as 1921, encountering numerous challenges along the way. In 1933, the Soviets made their first attempts to use a newly designed nitroglycerin-based ballistic gunpowder as a rocket propellant. This approach showed great promise, but also presented significant difficulties. It took 2 years to achieve the first practical results and another 2 years to resolve production issues, such as the inclusion of air pockets in the pressed powder sticks and high sensitivity to external temperatures. By 1937, these challenges had been overcome, and the new rockets entered production. The Germans simply failed to make progress in time. They only began experimenting with switching the rocket propellant from old smoke powder to the new nitroglycerin-based powder in 1935. Additionally, Germany chose a press technology for producing the compressed sticks, primarily because Krupp was eager to use hydraulic presses for the industry. In contrast, the USSR employed a screw pressing technique, which proved to be much more efficient. The result was that in 1941, When the Germans witnessed the destructive power of the Soviet rocket artillery, they urgently accelerated their development efforts. However, there was not enough time to design a propellant as efficient as the Soviet one. The weaker propellant meant that the Germans were largely confined to tube designs, which resulted in smaller salvos and lighter payloads. While still a powerful weapon, the Nebelwerfer did not inspire the same level of terror as the Katyusha, nor did it have the same groundbreaking impact on the battlefield. The Germans had been using rocket artillery since the start of the war, but it never quite achieved the battlefield-defining impact or battle-turning effect seen with the Soviet Katyusha. Ultimately, the Russian Katyusha may be considered more effective, as the Soviet Union's steamroller tactics, superior manufacturing capabilities, and almost unlimited mobility and fuel played crucial roles in their victory.